If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed because of the color of your hair or the number of candles on your last birthday cake, then I need you to listen. I need you to hear what happens when the world writes you off, when it decides your chapter is over before you've even written the ending. They think the quiet ones are weak. They think the grieving are broken. They are wrong. My story isn't about revenge. It wasn't, at least, not at first. At first, it was about love. A love so fierce it could burn down the world. And in the end, that's exactly what it did. It burned down their world. And from the ashes, I built a future for the only person who mattered. This is how I taught the system. I built a lesson it would never forget. The first sound I remember, after the silence, was the rain. Not a gentle spring shower, but a cold, angry November downpour, the kind that sluices dirt from the gutters and makes the world feel like it's weeping with you. My daughter Elizabeth was gone. One moment she was here, laughing on the phone about her daughter Sophia's latest masterpiece, a crayon drawing of a purple giraffe, and the next she was a void, a sudden, senseless aneurysm, a thief in the night that stole the light from my world, and the mother from my 7-year-old granddaughter. Sophia was sleeping in her little bed down the hall, blissfully unaware that her universe had just tilted off its axis. I was the one who had to hold it steady. At 68, with arthritis that sang arias in my knuckles on rainy days like this, I was all she had left, and she was all I had. That was a pact sealed in grief, a promise whispered into the sterile quiet of a hospital waiting room. The betrayal didn't come from the heavens or from fate. It came 2 weeks later, wearing a sensible navy pantsuit and carrying a faux leather briefcase. It came in the form of a knock on my door. When I opened it, a young woman stood on my porch, her expression a practiced blend of sympathy and authority. She was, she said, Miss Clark, from the Department of Child and Family Services. Her voice was too bright, too chipper, for the gray world I was living in. She said it was a routine follow-up, a wellness check, given the unfortunate circumstances. I let her in. What else was I to do? I was a grieving grandmother, trying to hold my world together with tape and prayers. I thought she was there to help. That was my first mistake. She walked through my small, tidy home, the one my late husband John and I had bought 30 years ago to escape the noise of the city. Her eyes, a pale, judgmental blue, didn't see the love baked into the walls, or the laughter absorbed by the worn floral sofa. They saw chipped paint on a baseboard. They saw a stack of unread mail on the counter. They saw a grandmother who looked tired. Of course I was tired. I was bone-weary, with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. Sophia was at school, a small mercy. I didn't want this woman's sterile presence tainting her home. Clark sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Sophia and I had made pancakes just that morning, and she opened her file. The questions started innocently enough. How was I coping? How was Sophia adjusting? Then they sharpened. What were my financial resources? Did I have a pension, a 401k? What was the plan for childcare? My answers seemed to fall into a dead space between us. I told her about John's life insurance, about our savings, about the fact that I had been Sophia's primary caregiver after school since she was a baby. It didn't matter. Her pen just kept scratching across a form on her clipboard, a form that I knew, with a sickening certainty, was a ledger of my inadequacies. The final blow came wrapped in the language of bureaucratic concern. She looked up, her face a mask of counterfeit pity. "Faye," she said, using my first name with a familiarity that felt like a violation, "we have to consider what's in the best interest of the child. At your age, raising a young girl is a significant undertaking. The department has concerns about your long-term ability to provide a stable environment. She used words like lacking resources and limited support network. She deemed me too old. She said they would be initiating proceedings to place Sophia in a temporary foster home, a more suitable environment, while they assessed a long-term solution. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room tilted. Foster care. They were going to take the last piece of my daughter, the brilliant, warm, living embodiment of all my love, and give her to strangers, because I was too old, because of a chip in the paint and a pile of mail. This woman, who couldn't have been more than 25, who had spent a total of 30 minutes in my home, had judged my entire life and found it wanting. She didn't see a grandmother fighting through hell to hold her family together. She saw a liability, an obstacle, a problem to be managed. She handed me a sheaf of papers, her expression unreadable. "The custody hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," she said, her voice crisp and final. "It's just a formality. The department's recommendation carries a lot of weight. You should probably prepare Sophia." And with that, she stood up, smoothed down her pantsuit, and left, the click of the door latch echoing in the sudden, crushing silence. I stood there, her words hanging in the air like poison. A formality. What she didn't know, what no one in that sterile, soulless office could possibly know, was that my name wasn't always Fay Miller. And 30 years ago, when I was State Senator Evelyn Reed, I didn't just help shape the child welfare laws. I wrote them. And at that hearing tomorrow, I wasn't just going to be representing myself. I was going to give Miss Clark and her entire department a masterclass in the legislative intent behind the very statutes they were so blithely and cruelly misinterpreting. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about survival. The hours after Miss Clark left were a blur of cold, suffocating panic. My house, which had always felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage, its walls closing in. Every object was a memory, a testament to the life they were trying to dismantle. The little step stool by the kitchen sink so Sophia could help with the dishes. The framed photo on the mantelpiece of Elizabeth, radiant in her cap and gown, me beside her, my arm around her shoulders, the faint, sweet smell of Elizabeth's perfume that still clung to the coat hanging in the hall closet. I sank onto the worn floral sofa, the one where Sophia and I read stories every night, and the grief I had been holding at bay for 2 weeks finally broke through the dam. It was a raw, guttural sound, a wail that came from the deepest part of my soul. I was mourning my daughter all over again, but this time the grief was laced with a new and terrifying poison: helplessness. They were going to take her. They were going to take my baby's baby. I wrapped my arms around myself, rocking back and forth, the stack of official papers a cold weight on the cushion beside me. My mind splintered, flashing back to a sunnier time. Sophia, age 5, her face smeared with chocolate, giggling as she helped me in the garden. She'd unearthed a fat earthworm and was holding it up for my inspection, her eyes wide with wonder. "Look, Nana Fay, he's a wriggly noodle," she'd shrieked with delight. That was my life. That was my reality, not the cold clinical assessment of a stranger. My daughter Elizabeth had been a single mother, a brilliant, hard-working nurse who poured everything she had into her daughter. I was her backup, her partner, her co-pilot in the beautiful, chaotic project of raising Sophia. When Elizabeth worked a double shift, I was there. When Sophia had a fever at 2 a.m., we were both there. We were a team. And now I was the only one left on the field. How could they not see that? How could they look at this tapestry of love and shared history and see only a liability? The anger began as a slow burn deep in my gut, a pilot light flickering to life in the frozen cavern of my despair. It was fueled by another memory, one that felt like it belonged to a different woman, a different lifetime. I was in my late 30s, standing on the floor of the state senate. My name was Evelyn Reed then. I was wearing a steel gray power suit, my hair professionally coiffed, my voice ringing with a passion that came from righteous fury. I was debating the final amendments to the Child Welfare Act. I remembered the face of Senator Thompson across the aisle, a pompous silver-haired man who argued for stricter, more rigid guidelines for kinship placements. He wanted to make it easier for the state to intervene, to remove children from what he called unconventional or under-resourced family situations. I stood up to him. I can still hear my own voice echoing in my memory. This bill, I'd argued, my hands gripping the podium, is not about creating a checklist for bureaucrats to tear families apart. It is about creating a safety net, not a snare. Its primary, fundamental, and non-negotiable purpose is to preserve familial bonds wherever it is safe and possible to do so. We are codifying a preference for kinship care, for grandmothers and aunts and uncles, because we recognize that love is the ultimate resource. A child's heart does not run on a budget, it runs on connection. I had fought tooth and nail for that language. I'd spent sleepless nights, drafting amendments, making calls, whipping votes. I'd poured my soul into that law, believing I was building a shield to protect children like Sophia, to protect families like mine. And now, that very shield was being used as a bludgeon against me by a 20-something social worker who probably thought legislative intent was a type of scented candle. The irony was so bitter, it almost made me laugh. After my first marriage ended, the marriage that had propelled me into politics as Evelyn Reed, I had met John. He was a history professor, a kind, quiet man who loved me for the woman I was, not the senator I had been. When we married, I took his name, Miller, and stepped away from public life. I was tired of the fight, of the constant scrutiny. I'd wanted peace. I wanted to be a wife, a mother, and eventually, a grandmother. I wanted to be Faye, not Senator Reed. It was a deliberate choice, a shedding of a skin. I hadn't hidden my past, but I hadn't advertised it either. Over the years, Evelyn Reed faded into a black and white photo in a history book, a name on an old piece of legislation. And Faye Miller just became Faye Miller, a grandmother in a small house with a leaky gutter and a loving heart. And that anonymity, that quiet life I had so carefully constructed, was now the very thing being used to destroy me. Miss Clark hadn't seen a former stateswoman with a deep understanding of the law. She'd seen an old woman in a cardigan. Something inside me shifted. The rocking stopped. I sat up, the tears drying on my cheeks, and a different kind of cold settled over me. It wasn't the cold of fear anymore. It was the cold of resolve. The quiet woman in the cardigan was gone. Senator Evelyn Reed was back. This wasn't just about Sophia anymore. This was about every grandparent who had ever been dismissed, every family member who had been deemed unsuitable by a flawed, overworked, and prejudiced system. Miss Clark and the department hadn't just made a mistake. They had declared war on my family. They had misinterpreted my law, my legacy, and they were about to find out what happened when you poked a sleeping bear. Not just a bear, but the very bear who designed the forest they were lost in. I picked up the phone. There was only one person I could call. His name was Arthur Vance, and 30 years ago, he hadn't been my lawyer. He'd been my chief of staff, the sharpest legal mind I'd ever known, and the man who had stood beside me when I passed that law. It was time for a reunion. It was no longer just about keeping my granddaughter. It was about principle. It wasn't about revenge, until in that precise moment, it absolutely was. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar, gravelly voice answered, sounding slightly irritated. Vance, just the one word. Arthur was never one for pleasantries. Arthur, I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. It's Evelyn. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could picture him perfectly, sitting in his leather-bound office, surrounded by stacks of books, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was probably 75 now, but I knew his mind would be as sharp as a tack. Evelyn Reed, he finally sputtered, the irritation replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. Good God, woman, I thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Where have you been for the last 2 decades? Running a spy ring in Monaco? I allowed myself a small, grim smile. Something far more dangerous, Arthur. I've been a grandmother. I explained everything. The sudden death of my daughter, my granddaughter Sophia, and the visit from the officious Miss Clark from Child and Family Services. I told him about the hearing scheduled for the next morning, the accusations of me being too old and lacking resources. As I spoke, I could feel the old alliance, the old partnership, snapping back into place. Arthur listened without interruption, his silence a sign of his intense focus. When I finished, he let out a long, low whistle. They're using the 93 Act against you, he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. The very act you bled for. The sheer, unmitigated gall. He paused. This Miss Clark, young, you said, ambitious, probably thinks legislative intent is something you look up on Wikipedia. His words were a balm to my raw nerves. He got it. He understood the profound, infuriating irony of it all. This isn't just an injustice, Evelyn. It's an insult to your entire career. It's an insult to me, for that matter. I think I still have paper cuts from collating the briefs for that bill. Then he told me something that solidified our new old partnership. He'd recently been pushed into a consultant role at his own law firm, the one he had helped build from the ground up. The younger partners, all slick suits and corporate jargon, thought his old-school methods were quaint. They saw his age, his experience, not as an asset but as a sign of being out of touch. They think I'm a dinosaur, Evelyn, he said, and for the first time I heard a crack in his gruff exterior. They want me to quietly fade away. This case of yours, it feels personal. And just like that, it wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. It was a battle against the casual, cruel dismissiveness of a world that worships youth and discards wisdom like an old newspaper. All right, Senator, Arthur said, and the old honorific sent a jolt of strength through me. The hearing is tomorrow morning. We don't have time for a full-scale legal assault. We need a silver bullet. We need to go for the throat. First things first, that lacking resources claim is garbage, and we're going to prove it. I spent the next hour on the phone with him while I tore through my file cabinet. John, my late husband, had been a meticulous man. Every financial document was perfectly organized. I pulled out the statements for my pension from my years in the state legislature, a detail I was sure Miss Clark had never even considered. I found the portfolio for my 401k, the life insurance policy from John, and the deed to my house, which had been paid off for over a decade. I even found the documents for the educational trust fund John and I had set up for Sophia the day she was born. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was more than enough. It was stable. It was secure. It was a fortress of fiscal responsibility that made Miss Clark's assessment look not just wrong, but maliciously negligent. Scan and email every last page to me, Arthur commanded. Next, we need to dismantle the too old and limited support networks narrative. That's subjective. It's prejudicial, and it's the weakest part of their case if we can drown them in counter evidence. Who knows you? Who loves you? Who sees you with Sophia? The names came tumbling out. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a retired nurse who often had Sophia over for milk and cookies. Sophia's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Albright, who had sent me a sympathy card praising Sophia's resilience and the strong support she clearly had at home. Dr. Evans, our family doctor for 20 years. My cousin Martha, who lived 2 towns over. Arthur cut me off. Good, we need them, we need their voices. I'm going to draft a standard affidavit form. It'll be a declaration of support, attesting to your character, your bond with Sophia, and your fitness as a guardian. I'll email it to you. Your job is to call every single one of those people tonight. Explain the situation. Get them to sign it, scan it, and send it back to me before midnight. We'll file them all with the court clerk first thing in the morning as a supplementary submission. We'll bury them in a paper avalanche of community support. The last piece of the plan was the most important. It was our secret weapon. Evelyn, Arthur said, his voice dropping, go to your garage. Do you still have them? The boxes from the old office. I knew exactly what he meant. Tucked away in the back of my garage, behind the lawnmower and a stack of old National Geographics, were 4 heavy, dusty banker's boxes. They were labeled simply, Senate Files, 1990 to 1996. I hadn't opened them in 20 years. They were a relic of a past life. They're here, I said. Good, Arthur replied, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. Find the files for the Child Welfare Act. I don't want the final bill. I want the drafts. I want my handwritten notes in the margins. I want the official transcripts from the floor debates. I want the minutes from the committee meetings. I want the legislative intent reports. I want the very DNA of that law. That is our silver bullet. Miss Clark is reading the body of the law. Tomorrow you're going to give her a lecture on its soul. After I hung up with Arthur, I felt a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt in decades. The grief was still there, a heavy cloak on my shoulders, but now it was joined by a warrior's resolve. I made the calls. The outrage from my friends and neighbors was immediate and fierce. Gable was so incensed, she said she'd march down to the department herself and give them a piece of her mind. Mrs. Albright, Sophia's teacher, was horrified. But you're the most stable part of her life right now, she'd said, her voice trembling with anger on my behalf. I'll write you a letter that will make their heads spin. By 10 p.m., my inbox was pinging with signed and scanned affidavits. It was a chorus of support, a testament to the life I had built, the community I had nurtured. It was the truth, and it was powerful. Then I went to the garage. The air was cold and smelled of dust and gasoline. I dragged the heavy boxes into the light of the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I pried open the lid of the first one. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air, the scent of my former life. And there it was, a thick file labeled SB 241, Child Welfare Reform. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. Inside were the ghosts of my past. My own handwriting, sharp and decisive, filled the margins of typed drafts, strengthened language on kinship preference. I had scrawled next to one clause, remove ambiguity on resource assessment, focus on stability, not raw income. I'd written on another, I found the official transcripts from the Senate floor debate. Reading them, I could hear my own voice, young and full of fire, arguing with Senator Thompson. I found the final committee report, the one that explicitly stated the legislature's intent, that the law should be a tool to prevent the unnecessary separation of families, and to give deference to loving relatives over the uncertainty of the foster system. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of my garage, surrounded by the evidence of my past, the weapons for my future. Miss Clark had judged Fay Miller, the quiet, grieving grandmother. She had no idea she was about to face Evelyn Reed, the woman who had written the very rules she thought she was enforcing. She had started this fight based on a superficial assessment of my present. I was going to end it with an undeniable lesson from my past. The pieces were all in place. The trap was set. All I had to do was walk into that courtroom and spring it. The first shot was fired, not in the courtroom, but via email, at 6 a.m. sharp. Arthur, true to his word, had consolidated everything into two formidable PDF documents. The first was a preliminary motion to dismiss, which he'd stayed up half the night drafting. It didn't play our trump card, my identity, but it was a masterclass in legal precision. It was a surgical strike. It cited specific sections of the Child Welfare Act, cross-referenced with established case law, and systematically dismantled every single point in Miss Clark's initial assessment report. It pointed out her failure to conduct a comprehensive financial review, as mandated by Section 4, subsection B of the Act. It highlighted her lack of due diligence in assessing my support network, citing a precedent from a 2003 case, in Reguardianship of Jones, which stated that a cursory single-visit evaluation is insufficient grounds for removal. The motion was polite, formal, and absolutely lethal. It was designed to make them question not just their case, but their own competence. The second PDF was the avalanche. It was a single 17-page document containing the scanned, signed, and notarized affidavits from my community. Mrs. Gable, the retired nurse next door; Mrs. Albright, Sophia's teacher; Dr. Evans, our family doctor; my cousin Martha, friends from my book club; even Mr. Henderson, the cranky old man from down the street, who I occasionally brought soup to. Each statement was a glowing testament to my bond with Sophia, my stability, and my character. It was a wall of evidence that directly contradicted Miss Clark's narrative of an isolated, struggling old woman. Arthur had CC'd the court clerk, the main office of the Department of Child and Family Services, Miss Clark's direct email address, and for good measure, her department head, a man named Marcus Peterson, whose name Arthur had found on the department's website. Then he sent it. The silent takeover had begun. I didn't have to wait long for the first tremor of panic. At 7:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A message popped up a minute later. It was Miss Clark. Her voice, once so full of chipper authority, was now tight and strained. Good morning, Miss Miller," she began, stumbling over my name. We received a motion from an attorney, a Mr. Vance. I just wanted to touch base before the hearing this morning. Perhaps we could discuss this. There may have been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. The condescension was gone, replaced by the unmistakable scent of fear. She had expected a tearful, unprepared grandmother. She got a legal broadside from a seasoned attorney, and she didn't know what to do. I didn't call her back. Silence, as Arthur had advised, was a weapon. Let them stew in their own incompetence. I focused on Sophia. I woke her up gently, made her favorite breakfast of cinnamon toast, and packed her lunch. I explained that Nana had to go to a very important meeting today, so Mrs. Gable would be picking her up from school. I kept my voice light, my hands steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. Her innocent, trusting face was all the motivation I needed. This was for her, all of it. After I walked her to the bus stop, I came home and put on my armor. It wasn't a power suit. Not this time. It was a simple, elegant charcoal gray dress, a string of pearls John had given me, and my hair pulled back in a neat, dignified chignon. I was no longer playing the part of Fay Miller, grieving grandmother. I was stepping into the role of Evelyn Reed, a woman who knew her own power. The second phone call came at 8:30 a.m. as I was getting into my car. This time, The caller ID showed the main number for the DCFS. I answered. A man's brusque voice was on the other end. Faye Miller? This is Marcus Peterson. I'm the director here at the department. His tone was one of forced, impatient authority. He was trying to sound like he was in control. I've just been made aware of the extensive documentation your attorney filed this morning. Frankly, Miss Miller, I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here. Miss Clark is a junior social worker. Perhaps her initial report was incomplete. The perhaps was galling. He was trying to minimize the damage, to frame it as a simple clerical error. I'd like to propose we postpone this morning's hearing, he continued. Give us a chance to review this new information and conduct a more thorough assessment. This was it, the first attempt to retreat. They were panicking. They wanted to pull the case back, bury it in paperwork, and avoid the public forum of a courtroom where their negligence would be on full display. I held the phone, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I could have said yes. I could have accepted their quiet retreat, and it would have all been over, but it wasn't enough. A quiet victory wouldn't change the systemic prejudice that led to this moment. It wouldn't teach them the lesson they needed to learn. It wouldn't protect the next grandmother who didn't have a past as a state senator to fall back on. No, Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. I don't think a postponement will be necessary. Miss Clark made her recommendation. The department endorsed it. A hearing was scheduled. I will see you in court. I hung up before he could respond. The time for quiet discussion was over. It was time for a public reckoning. They had built this stage, and I was damn well going to perform on it. The panic on their side must have escalated exponentially after that call. They had tried to de-escalate, and I had refused. They were walking into a hearing with a case that was now riddled with holes, facing an attorney they didn't know, and a client who was refusing to be intimidated. They were used to dealing with frightened, overwhelmed people, not with organized, strategic opposition. Their whole strategy was based on an imbalance of power, and in the span of a few hours, I had completely upended it. I imagined the frantic conversations happening in their office, Clark, pale and defensive, trying to justify her report. Mr. Peterson, angry and flustered, realizing this wasn't the simple rubber stamp case he'd expected. They had poked what they thought was a harmless old woman, and now they were discovering, to their horror, that they had disturbed a hornet's nest. The silent takeover was complete. The power had shifted. Now all that was left was the checkmate. As I walked toward the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of calm. The frantic energy of the morning had settled into a steely resolve. The community support had been the first wave of the assault, a demonstration of present-day strength. The affidavits were a testament to Faye Miller's life, the life I had chosen, but the final attack would come from Evelyn Reed's past. The flood of emails and legal filings had already shaken their foundation. Mr. Peterson's desperate call to postpone was proof of that. He knew their case was built on sand, and he could feel the tide coming in. They had tried to counter my silent, strategic moves with frantic, clumsy ones. They were playing checkers. Arthur and I were playing chess. Their desperation became even more apparent just before the hearing was set to begin. I was sitting on a bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, reviewing my notes, when Miss Clark and Mr. Peterson approached me. Arthur had advised me to arrive separately. He was already inside, setting the stage. Miss Clark looked haggard. The confident, chipper professional from 2 days ago was gone, replaced by a nervous young woman who couldn't meet my eyes. Mr. Peterson, a stout man with a florid face, did all the talking. His earlier brusqueness was gone, replaced by a syrupy, condescending tone that was somehow even more insulting. Miss Miller, he began, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. There's really no need for all this unpleasantness. We all want what's best for Sophia. He gestured vaguely toward the courtroom door. These proceedings, they can be traumatic for a child. We've reviewed the letters of support you provided. Very impressive. Clearly you have a vibrant community. He was trying to sound gracious, as if he were bestowing a great compliment. Given this new information, the department is prepared to withdraw its petition for temporary custody and instead work with you to create a collaborative support plan. It was a last-ditch effort to avoid the humiliation of a public hearing. A collaborative support plan was their way of saving face, of pretending this was a partnership all along, not a hostile action they had initiated. They wanted to rewrite history, to erase their gross misjudgment. I looked from his sweating face to Miss Clark's downcast eyes. They still didn't get it. They thought this was about procedure, about winning or losing a case. They didn't understand that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had threatened to take my granddaughter. They had called my entire life, my love for my family, insufficient. A collaborative plan was an insult. Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice quiet but firm, 2 days ago, your department, through your agent Miss Clark, deemed me unfit to care for my own grandchild. You threatened to put her in the hands of strangers, based on a 20-minute visit and a set of prejudices about my age. You did not offer a collaborative plan. Then you offered me a court date. I'm simply here to keep the appointment you made. Peterson's face hardened. The mask of civility dropped. You're making a mistake, he hissed, his voice low. You can't win. The court defers to our professional assessment. His arrogance, even in the face of his crumbling case, was breathtaking. He still believed the system was rigged in his favor. That was his fatal flaw. He saw the system as a tool for his own authority. He didn't realize I saw it as a blueprint, because I had been its architect. I simply stood up, smoothed down my dress, and walked past them into the courtroom, without another word, leaving them standing in the hallway, their faces a mixture of fury and confusion. The power shift was palpable. They had come to me, trying to bargain their way out of a fire they had started, and I had calmly told them to let it burn. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered from my days in the Capitol, but the feeling was the same. The scent of old wood and nervous tension, a bored-looking bailiff, a family court judge, a woman named Judge Al-Hassan, who looked sharp and no-nonsense. Arthur was at the petitioner's table, a single, neat file in front of him. He gave me a subtle nod as I took my seat. Miss Clark and Mr. Peterson scurried in a moment later, looking flustered, and took their places at the opposite table. The hearing began. Judge Al-Hassan looked down at the paperwork before her, a frown creasing her brow. Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice sharp, I see a petition for removal filed by your department, and then I see a motion to dismiss. 17 pages of affidavits filed this morning in opposition. This is an unusual amount of activity for a preliminary custody hearing. Can you please enlighten me as to what is going on? Mr. Peterson stood, clearing his throat. He launched into a speech about the department's abundance of caution and their solemn duty to protect the welfare of the child. He tried to frame their petition as a procedural necessity, a way to ensure all resources were being explored. He was tap dancing, and it was a clumsy performance. He was trying to sound reasonable, but the judge's expression grew more and more impatient. When it was Arthur's turn, he stood up slowly. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm and respectful, we believe the department has acted not with an abundance of caution, but with a profound and startling degree of prejudice. They have fundamentally misinterpreted the statutes governing kinship placement. But I am not the one who will be making that argument today. He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words hang in the air. My client, Miss Fay Miller, will be representing herself in this matter. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Judge Al-Hassan raised an eyebrow. Mr. Peterson smirked, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. He thought this was a sign of weakness, an emotional gambit by an amateur. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the podium. This was my stage now. I looked directly at the judge. Then I let my gaze drift over to Miss Clark and Mr. Peterson. Her face was pale. His was confident. The fool. "Good morning, Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady. The acoustics in the small room were excellent. Every word would land with precision. "My name is Fay Miller. I am the maternal grandmother of Sophia Miller, and I am here today to contest the petition to remove her from my care. The department's case, as outlined by Miss Clark and Director Peterson, rests on the assertion that I am too old and lacking the resources to be a suitable guardian, as per their interpretation of the State Child Welfare Act of 1993. I let the date hang in the air for a moment. I saw a flicker of confusion on Mr. Peterson's face. The department's interpretation of this act is, to put it mildly, flawed, I continued, my voice gaining strength. It is a lazy, superficial reading of a complex piece of legislation, a reading that completely ignores the foundational principles upon which it was built. It ignores the legislative record, the committee reports, and the floor debates that clarified its purpose. I know this, Your Honor, not because I am a concerned grandmother who has done her homework. I paused, letting the silence stretch. I picked up a file from the podium, the file from my garage. I know this because the law they are misusing, the statute they are wielding as a weapon to tear my family apart, bears my name. I looked directly at Miss Clark, whose jaw had gone slack. I looked at Mr. Peterson, whose smug expression was frozen on his face, beginning to crumble like old plaster. My name is Fay Miller, I repeated. But 30 years ago, when I served for 3 terms in the state senate, my name was Evelyn Reed, and as the chair of the Family and Youth Services Committee, I was the lead author and sponsor of the Child Welfare Act of 1993. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The bailiff, who had been slouched in his chair, was sitting bolt upright. Judge Al-Hassan was staring at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. Arthur had a faint, satisfied smile on his face. And Mr. Peterson looked like he had been struck by lightning. "So, with the court's indulgence," I said, my voice resonating with an authority that had been dormant for 20 years, "I would like to offer Miss Clark and Director Peterson a brief tutorial on the legislative intent of the statute they are supposed to be upholding." The vindication had begun. I opened my file, chapter and verse. For the next 10 minutes, I didn't just argue my case, I dismantled theirs, piece by piece, using their own supposed rulebook. I held up a transcript from the Senate floor debate, dated May 12, 1993. "Let's start with the lacking resources claim," I said, my eyes fixed on Mr. Peterson. On this date, I stood on the Senate floor and debated this very point with the late Senator Thompson. He wanted a rigid income-based metric. I argued, and the legislature ultimately agreed, that the term resources was intentionally broad. It was meant to encompass not just financial assets, but emotional stability, community support, and pre-existing familial bonds. I have the transcript right here. My words were, "A loving home is the single greatest resource a child can have." Miss Clark's report mentions a chip in my baseboard. It does not mention the paid-off mortgage, the stable pension, or the educational trust fund I have maintained for my granddaughter since her birth. That is not an assessment, Your Honor. That is a willful act of ignorance. I moved on to the issue of my age. Now for the absurd and frankly discriminatory claim that I am too old. My voice dripped with contempt. I will refer the department to the official committee report, page 12, section 3. It explicitly states, and I quote, "Age in and of itself shall not be the sole or primary determining factor in a kinship placement assessment." We wrote that line specifically to prevent the kind of baseless ageism that is on display here today. We wrote it to protect grandparents, to honor their wisdom and their willingness to step in during a crisis. To use my age against me is not just a misinterpretation of the law, it is a direct violation of its stated intent. I looked at Miss Clark. Her face was ashen. She was shrinking in her chair, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. This law, I said, my voice rising with passion, was my life's work. I fought for it because I saw too many families being destroyed by a cold, indifferent bureaucracy. I wrote it to be a shield for children like Sophia, not a sword to be used against grandmothers like me. Your Honor, the department's actions in this case are not just wrong, they are a perversion of the very principles of child welfare. They are a lazy, prejudiced, and dangerous dereliction of their statutory duty. I closed my file with a soft, final thud. The department did not come to my home to assess my fitness. They came to my home to confirm a bias. They saw a grieving 68-year-old woman, and they checked a box. They didn't see a family. They didn't see love, and they certainly didn't see the person who wrote the damn law. I sat down. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. Judge Al-Hassan slowly took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked at Mr. Peterson, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Director Peterson," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "do you have anything to say in response to Senator Reid?" Peterson stood up, but no words came out. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish. He was utterly, completely defeated. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, only to discover his opponent had designed the gun, written the manual, and built the factory. "I worry, Your Honor, there has been a significant misunderstanding," he stammered. Judge Al-Hassan cut him off. "I'll say," she snapped, "the petition by the Department of Child and Family Services is dismissed, with extreme prejudice. Custody of Sophia Miller is hereby fully and unconditionally affirmed with her grandmother, Faye Miller." She then turned her full attention to Peterson and Clark. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full internal review of your department's assessment procedures to be submitted to my office within 60 days. And Miss Clark," she said, her voice like steel, "I would suggest you spend some time actually reading the laws you are tasked with enforcing, including the legislative history." Court is adjourned. The gavel cracked like a gunshot, sealing their fate and my victory. It was over. I had won. I looked over at Arthur, who gave me a slow, proud wink. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The weight of the past few days, the past few weeks, finally lifting from my shoulders. The days that followed the hearing were quiet, and that quiet was the sweetest sound I had ever known. It was the sound of peace, the sound of safety. Sophia and I fell back into our rhythm, but it was a new rhythm, one unburdened by the threat that had loomed over us. We made pancakes. We read stories on the worn floral sofa. I helped her with a school project about the solar system, and as we glued cotton balls onto a black poster board to make a starry galaxy, I saw the light fully return to her eyes. She was happy. She was home, and that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. The world I had fought to protect was right here, in this small, tidy house, smelling of cinnamon and glue. The fallout for the Department of Child and Family Services was swift, and from what Arthur told me, brutal. The story of a retired state senator having to use her own law to defend herself against the agency meant to uphold it was too juicy for the local news to ignore. An old reporter friend of Arthur's ran a feature piece on it, a scathing expose on the systemic issues of ageism and negligence at the department. Mr. Peterson was forced into an early retirement, a euphemism for being shoved out the door in disgrace, and Miss Clark, I learned, was reassigned to a dreary records room in the basement, a bureaucratic purgatory from which she would likely never emerge. I took no joy in their downfall. Well, perhaps a little. It wasn't about revenge, but the vindication was undeniably sweet. Their fate wasn't my doing. It was the natural consequence of their own arrogance and incompetence. They had built their own cage, and the door had simply swung shut behind them. A few weeks later, I received a formal written apology from the new acting director of the department. It was filled with carefully chosen words of regret and promises of reform. I put it in the shredder. The real apology was in the silence, in the absence of their sterile, judgmental presence in my life. The real victory was in the sound of Sophia's laughter as she chased a butterfly in the backyard. My life as Evelyn Reed was a lifetime ago. I had fought my battles, built my legacy, and then chosen a quieter path. I never wanted to be that person again, but they forced my hand. They reminded me that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest histories. They reminded me that you must never, ever underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. So now I'm speaking to you. To anyone who has ever been made to feel small, to feel old, to feel like their worth has an expiration date, your experience is not a liability. It is your strength. Your history is not a burden. It is your armor. They may not see it. They may look at you and see only what they want to see, a caricature, a stereotype. Let them underestimate you. Let them believe you are weak, or broken, or finished, and when they push you too far, when they threaten the things you hold most dear, you will rise. You will find that voice you thought was lost, that strength you thought had faded, and you will remind them, and the world, that you are not a footnote in someone else's story. You are the author of your own, and your best chapter may be yet to come. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever faced a similar battle, or if you just believe in standing up to injustice, I hope you'll share this video. The more we share our stories, the less invisible we become. Please like and subscribe for more stories of real people finding their strength. And in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me about a time you surprised someone who underestimated you. Let's create a community of voices that are too loud to be ignored.